Hello, and welcome to the SEI's webcast, Threat Hunting, What Should Keep All of Us Up at Night. My name is Matthew Butkovic. I'm the Technical Director for Cyber Risk and Resilience in the CERT Division. We're going to make this an interactive session. Please do submit your comments in the YouTube chat function. I would like to thank you for joining us. I'd also like to thank Dan Ruef for joining us. Welcome, Dan. Dan is our presenter today. He is a technical manager for the Network Situational Awareness team in the CERT Division. Dan is an expert in NetFlow analysis and determining insights from network traffic. Today, he's going to walk us through a number of topics that will make your organization more capable of detecting things that matter on your network. So Dan, I want to get your presentation, but just by way of introduction, I should also note you've been with the SEI for about 15 years. And in that time, you developed a comprehensive set of tools that allow folks to do the sort of analysis you're describing today. Dan is one of our best and brightest, and it's my pleasure to moderate today's discussion. Today's discussion will start with a presentation from Dan, and throughout we'll be answering questions. So Dan, over to you.
Yeah, thanks a lot. And thanks everybody for submitting their questions ahead of time. We're going to cover ways you can get started with threat hunting, things to be concerned about, and ways that you can make progress for your own good. And we'll be going back and forth between presentation, some slides that are valuable, and then just some discussion with Matt and I. So we'll start in with the slides. And accounts and descriptions of this talk may not be rebroadcast, retransmitted without the express written consent of Carnegie Mellon and maybe Major League Baseball. But to really get started, have any of you seen or heard promises like this? Limitless integrations, advanced automation, unified observability, increased coverage with machine learning and more, and other big, powerful qualities to add to your detection systems. There's nothing wrong with any of these, but it is one of the first hurdles that I want to go into today. And if you've seen the movie Up, you will remember the scenes when the dog is continually distracted by squirrels. And so squirrels is the first big thing that should keep us up at night, is being distracted and getting away from what we need to really be doing. None of these claims, that's not what it's supposed to, none of these claims are incorrect from the previous slide. But what's missing is you. And it's that all of these need to be tailored to your detections, your mitigations, your data, and your processes. They can't just do it all for you by themselves. Things need to have context behind them. They need to fit in with your day-to-day and really focus on what you want to mitigate as a result of these detections. It's not that it's all hype, it's that it's maybe a little incomplete. And so trying to not get distracted is a way to continue to move forward. And the other thing that worries me is mustaches. And that's a little silly, but it's the idea of missing the inspection of activity that's right under your nose. It might not seem very exciting, but you're collecting it and you don't really know what is there because you're missing stuff, maybe from getting distracted. And so a few things that would qualify for activity that you're missing that's right under your nose are things like application label distribution. Application label is what we call the application protocol that's being used. Was it a DNS query? Was it an SSL connection? Was it a web connection? Was it an email connection? Are you aware of the distribution of what's going on your network? Just a simple listing of protocols can tell you what's really going on your network that's right there for you to log and notice differences from. Are you aware of all the remote domains that you're connecting to? That's all there in the traffic. It does not require significant analysis. You can have that list. Policy violations. By collecting network data or even host data, you can create detections that identify policy violations. And good policies lead to more direct detections. So if you find that you can't detect policy violations, maybe your policies need cleaned up a little bit. But there's ways to detect policy violations right in the data you're already collecting. Are you scanning or are you incorporating cyber intel indicators into your analysis? That's a simple first step. that you already have the data, you already have your indicators, correlating it with cyber intel feeds can give you a head start. Are you aware of the top talkers, the hosts on your network that are sending the most out? Some of it might not be a surprise, big servers, things of that nature, but do you know which ones? These are simple things that you can answer just by paying attention to what's already there. Same with the remote hosts that have the most receiving. Who are you talking to the most? And on that front, what services on your network are responding? What does the public see beyond your users going on the internet? What is responding to scans? What is responding to service requests? That's all there in the network data. You can see it by looking at the connections to certain ports to and from. And so missing these basic things that don't require significant analysis leaves you a little less off.
Yeah, thanks. I really like the way you've described that. So it sounds to me like one of the central themes is that don't become distracted, but rather focus on the things that are actually of maximum benefit. It makes a lot of sense to me. So when I think about this, it's like you have a box of puzzle pieces, and you can sort of start anywhere in assembling that puzzle, but it's easy to get distracted and work on that corner to the loss of the larger picture that you're trying to make. I'm wondering about some other technologies and where they fit on the spectrum of distraction or something that you should take on board as an input when you're considering your network monitoring. For instance, how do technologies like VPNs and zero trust affect network situational awareness?
Well, of course, it'll be different for every setup, but these security tools that may add additional encryption or hide some of the network traffic, they should be watched. If you have zero trust deployed or a VPN connection protecting particular high value assets, you should be making sure that all the connections to those assets use that security posture. If there are particular authentication handshakes that should occur first, you can make sure that those are actually happening for all of the connections. You might not be able to see the encrypted data anymore, but if it was encrypted with a cipher suite that you accept and with the authentication protocols you require, you can be pretty confident that what you deployed is working. You don't want a case of a very impressive, safe, locked door and a big hole in the wall next to it.
Yeah.
So just simply observing, are all the connections to these things, either VPN, zero trust, protected, are they doing what they're supposed to be doing? And then for how it can affect network traffic, it may bundle them. All of your connections from the outside may come through, say, a zero trust relay. Well, that's fine if you know that. And then you know that the traffic will all come from the same place, or maybe goes out to the same place on the way out to the internet. If you can document what's expected, you can more easily discover what's incorrect.
Thanks, Dan. So it sounds to me that, right, certainly these technologies may add a certain opacity to network analysis.
It's a good way to put
But
it.
that's not a reason to give up, right? That you should be able to baseline and understand behavior no matter which combinations or stack of technology you're using. Is that fair?
That's a great way to put it. It may change things, so you can learn from observables how it changes and now account for that in baselines and expected behavior. You can't find anomalies or discrepancies without knowing expected behavior. And that takes me to one of the key points that I hope everyone leaves with.
Okay.
Not all threats are anomalies, and not all anomalies are threats. That is one of the biggest assumptions people make, that I'll just find the anomalies and therefore they are all threats. Or that all threats can be discovered by anomaly detection. They are different. Sometimes threats are anomalies, in which case some statistical methods can be more apt to find those things, but not all the time. And one of the cause of this misconception is that there's an assumption that the traffic or the data is very regular or normal, and so thus anomalies are easy to detect, or that they are meaningful. If you have lots of variability in your data, it's hard to even decide something is an anomaly. And so just because something is an anomaly, it's not necessarily a threat, and not all threats can be observed as anomalies.
So something that's low frequency could be a threat. It may be anomalous, or the inverse is you could have something that's high frequency, that's a threat. Right. So I think it's important to explain that both of those conditions can exist, right?
That's exactly right. And the whole point of doing network monitoring or other cyber data monitoring is to find threats that you can mitigate, not to play with statistics, which I have seen a lot. That is a little snarky, and I apologize. And one question that I've gotten a few times is, what is the difference between an anomaly and an outlier? And to me, the answer is nothing. Anomalies sound more mysterious and more exotic, while an outlier is usually an extreme value on a scale you've decided to measure. We're measuring byte counts, so it's an outlier. But when you don't know what it is, it's an anomaly, and it simply sounds cooler. And so in my mind, it's not any different. And the second movie reference to date me is in Armageddon. It begins with, the anomaly was spotted at 1648. Well, that's way cooler than the thing in the sky. So anomalies have a mysterious quality of them. And so don't overthink them. They're the same as outliers.
So standard and something that deviates from standard is really what we're saying.
Yes. Yes. And so where do you start then? So we talked about threats and anomalies. Well, that's great. It's a nomenclature problem. So where do you start? And for me, it's starting with a threat behavior. Find the threat you want to find. Look into that. And maybe it's an anomaly that you can find with outlier detection or clustering or something like that. But it's the threat that matters, not finding anomalous behavior, because the goal is to find threats to mitigate them. And another aspect that makes this a little more difficult and why the threat focused is important is when you're analyzing data that was monitored as opposed to logged. And I'll talk about that in a minute. Monitoring data requires two conversions. Humans or systems do things, and then we try to standardize that into a data record. Then we analyze the data records because that's all we have. And then we have to draw inferences back to human or system behavior. So if you're not focused on the threat and what someone might have been doing or trying to do, and you're just looking at the data, you're missing two conversions or translations that can send you down paths that don't lead to mitigations and improving your network or your hosts or whatever data you're trying to use to protect your network. So that's always a big thing. And in my definitions, and I made this up, sorry, monitor data is when you're observing all of the behavior and trying to standardize it into a record. While logging is when, usually within an application, these are all the actions you can take in my application, and I will log all of them. And so that is not standard records. So NetFlow, for example, is monitored. Packets go by, and we try to standardize the record keeping of that. While, say, an Outlook log is sent email, received email. They're standard record types, of course, but it's this explicit action. So when you're dealing with monitored data, it's like a stakeout. Okay, you record everything as best you can. And as you build a list of threats you want to detect, the best way to get started is to do one. Do the first one all the way, because there is no such query as select star from star where suspicious equals true. No one analytic or detection can just tell you all the things you're interested in. Doesn't work that way. If so, we wouldn't be here. We would just be running that query. But being as that's not the case, that this thing exists, you take one threat, one activity you want to detect, finish the analytic, triage the alerts, and be done with it. And then move on to the next one. And you build that expertise, and each one takes less amount of time. So just starting with one, knowing it won't find everything, is how I always go about doing it.
A question, Jan. So there's a question section coming from the audience. So Roy, who's a friend of the SEI, has written and said, what about things like phishing attacks? If you're specifically interested in identifying that threat in your network, what are some indicators you'd look for in the sort of analysis you're describing?
Well, I would use the email logs versus, say, NetFlow as step one. Looking for particular terms or using phishing analysis that might be built in, spam detection, et cetera, and cataloging senders, subject lines, common things, and then building an idea of what phishing looks like when sent to your organization. If you want to take it a step further, you could try to find the IP addresses that may have sent the associated connection, sent the email, associated NetFlow records, trying to link it up with the email based on times and sizes, which can be difficult, and be able to just have more than this email address, which
Sure.
can be spoofed, is something we want to block. You could try to take it a little further, if it's in a certain ASN, but it's taking it piece by piece. There isn't going to be just give me all the phishing emails and block them. We wish.
Yeah, so understanding the limitations of the approaches and then federating approaches to get the insights you need. I think it's a really good answer. I have another question for you. So there's a great deal of discussion now in all domains about the emergence of machine learning and artificial intelligence to do tasks that require pattern recognition, correlation, analysis. Thoughts about how it's trite to say, but the rise of AI or the emergence of AI and machine learning is modifying assumptions about this sort of analysis and maybe ways it's improving our capabilities. Or conversely, what are some things that the audience needs to know when it comes to the limitations of what maybe folks are advertising as the future of using AI and ML for these tasks?
That's a great topic to bring up. To me, I see machine learning and AI as tools to augment the detection capabilities we already have. When it comes to analyzing and making determinations about behavior that we don't entirely understand, that's where the advanced computing of AI and machine learning comes in. If we can fully define the behavior and we're finding those type of activities to our satisfaction, then I think you keep going with that and you find additional ways, additional behaviors you don't understand, and try to find those correlations with the advanced computing. One of which being kind of treating AI as if you had another person on your staff, in that analyzing the outputs of detections and the triage times and benign positives and true positives, which types of alerts give us the best information. Because in the end, you're trying to find things to mitigate, not just find alerts. And so AI and ML incorporated in the triage process, that when these fields are populated, the time to triage is less. Great, we should add those enrichments to everything. When these particular scenarios arise, it takes analysts way longer to triage the alert. That's time and efficiency. Incorporating it there, where we can't necessarily automate and define the behavior of an analyst making decisions, is a great place to add. And then it's an additional computation tool for anomaly detection or other analysis that maybe a straightforward script can't do. But it's a tool to augment what we currently have.
So I'm hearing augment, not replace, right? That's the current state of play, right? Which is interesting and important to understand. There's a question from the audience. I think it's worth mentioning now, Deanne. So Brian asked, how would you split out monitoring data and log data?
How would I split them? I think you treat them differently in that in one, you're trying to, with monitor data, it's more behaviors. With inferences and log data, you can look for explicit actions.
Mm-hmm.
Permission increased to this value, email sent. You can get a more confident schedule of what had happened.
Right.
Than with NetFlow, for example, where it's just this connection was made, you're not entirely sure what was sent.
So is it the richness of what you can determine based on the data element you're examining? Is that what we're saying?
Each individual data element.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
And they can be used in conjunction with each other because they tell you different things, because you're trying to find different things. If you're trying to make sure your, say, Microsoft 365 policies are properly in effect, that's probably going to be in your application logs, but that won't help you about firewall rules and other policy violations. And so it's about using the data source that gives you what you need to make your enterprise safer. That's always the key. And no data source will do it all, and that's fine. So you get what you need to hit your workflows.
So it's really fit for purpose.
Yeah, fit for purpose. And if you want to store, say, NetFlow and I don't know, application logs in a data lake, you do want to make sure you've aligned the data source names, or at least the types, and things like the Elastic Common Schema or the Splunk. It's not called the Splunk Common Schema, but the Splunk Common Data Type data name allows for those correlations for automated queries to jump from one to the next.
I know that scale and considerations for storage are a large part of the work your team does. So optimizing those things. I know that's where we're headed next in the presentation, and likely the audience wants to hear about how you truly staggering scale of records that the team is interrogating with the tools.
Yeah. And NetFlow at scale, stored for a very long time, has always been our specialty. That is the point of Silk. And we'll get into the tools in a few moments. But one of the key pieces to understand all this is not all logs or data sources were necessarily designed for long-term storage and weren't necessarily designed for security purposes. Traditional network sensors like ours, YAF or Zeek, or Suricata, things like that, they were made for it. Their records are as optimized as they can get them. They're made for you to create a repository of the past. But not all logs are designed for that. So the key is to determine what insights you can get from each data source, which is what you mentioned before, the purpose-driven data storage and analysis. And so just understanding that not everything is meant to be stored in the repository forever can help start to account for the incredible data sizes. And I do want to go into one example, because I don't want that to sound like some broad bit of guidance that just sounds great, but how do I apply it? So I want to jump into a quick detailed thing about AWS VPC flow logs, because this is a perfect example. I should have said a prime example because it's Amazon, but sorry. AWS VPC flow logs. And before I start, it's going to sound like I am criticizing the logs. I am not. They never said this was as good as and efficient as Zeek or YAF. They said they will give you network flow logs that can be used for security, troubleshooting, proof of service, plenty of things that this can be used for. And so just taking it and pretending it can become your next Silk or Zeek repository in Splunk can yield some inefficiencies. So I want to quickly go through what's in these records to help break down what I want to get into.
And Dan, just before you do that, so these are the native raw logs, correct?
Yes, thank you. This is what AWS will give you when you turn on network flow logging within VPCs in your accounts.
Perfect.
Click a couple buttons and you get it. Thank you. Yes, this comes with it. A couple clicks away, a couple checks away, and you got yourself 8 VPC flow logs coming in. Thank you. The first line of fields here should look like any other NetFlow that any of us have dealt with before. Timestamps, IP addresses, ports and protocols and bytes. Exactly what you'd expect to be in there. Exactly what we store in Silk and all these other NetFlow tools store forever, and that's what you do analysis in. But then they add a bunch of service and cloud-specific information. Notice particularly on the right, lots and lots of bits and bytes used for interface ID, instance ID, VPC ID, your account ID. These are in every single record. And that's very useful if you're troubleshooting an elaborate cloud setup where you have regions talking to regions and VPCs going back and forth, or you have complicated routing and software-defined networking in the cloud, and you want to see where your packets are going. this will help you determine that. But once everything's flowing right, I am of the opinion you don't have to store an account ID, which is 15, 20 bytes in every single record you store forever. Same with interface IDs and instances IDs. And if it's your account and your VPCs, you should have those IDs. And then there's some additional metadata fields that let you know if it's IPv4, IPv6, the flow direction, things of that nature. And so these fields make up all of the records. So if you turn it on, store everything, this is what it ends up looking like. And I know that's difficult to see, but it's the repeated values that should stand out despite the lack of clarity in here. And so storing everything, all of the yellow columns to the right, that's just wasted storage, wasted money, wasted compute on the records to analyze it. And so if you look at the bottom, there's a table there that's referenced by the IP address from the internal IP address, in this case, 10.1.1.50. And all of the rest of the terms to the right are always the same. It's always the same user availability zone, instance, account, VPC. And so building a lookup table for your IPs and interfaces that map to all these very long, very static values can save about 50% of the storage.
50%.
50%.
So half of your storage.
Yeah. Now you have to do the work to script it out, but this is just an example of if this is what you want to store, maybe not storing everything leads you to more efficient storage, more efficient lookups, less cost, or more time to keep data for.
So I imagine that there comes this moment when you're deciding what to keep. And I think back to when I was more directly involved in monitoring systems. Your inclination is to keep everything because it might be useful. This is a great example, Dan, where if you apply a little critical thinking, you understand the construction of the information itself, you can save a great deal of storage and time and cost by making smart decisions.
Yeah. And again, I am not criticizing what AWS is producing for you.
Sure.
Because if you are debugging your environment, you need to know that, oh, I'm having trouble connecting this region to another region. It might be that gateway. That's essential information that without these records, you'll never know that a packet is making it here and here and here, and then that's it. You'll never know that without these records. Also, if it's for proof of service, because these are your router logs that on-prem at home you might be able to get. But when you say this can be your flow storage forever, which they didn't say, but people do that.
Right.
Again, they didn't promise it. So you can't assume their intentions and then add criticism. So when people are going to just store it forever, you're wasting a bunch of space on text-based records that you might be able to script out. And the next thing I want to jump to, Matt and I mentioned it a few times, is the free tooling that SEI and CERT provide. These are very mature tools. They've been around for a couple decades, at least some of them, used around the world. So they're not just little play toys. They're very mature tooling, and they can really help because they're also free, like I said, build you a baseline for some network monitoring, network collection capabilities. And so I want to run through them, and I left them up as a slide for reference as I'm talking. They're all available on the website up at top, which will be in the liner notes and an email later. But Silk is our bread and butter tool. It takes flows from a number of sources, either our sensor, Cisco routers, stores them in very compact binary formats, provides mechanisms to analyze, retrieve, and analyze and output for your flow analytics. YAF is our network sensor, and that means it takes packets and makes flows. Those packets can come from a live interface, which is probably what most people are envisioning, like a span port on an edge router. It can also take PCAP, whether it's sitting around or had been collected elsewhere, generate flows from those. Again, that's all free on the website. UNX OBP is an unexpected outbound protocol detection capability And so it looks at what I call the tail protocols. Well, most people call it the tail protocols, the less used protocols. SMB, RDP, LDAP, IMAP, ICMP tunneling, or ICMP echoes, things like that. And does some aggregations and sends alerts to say these are some unexpected or new connections in these less used protocols. So they're probably worth paying attention to. That's cloud-based. That's all available on the web, on our website. It uses what we call Nets and NiFi, which is a NiFi processor for Silk binary files. So NiFi is a tool that has guaranteed delivery and builds data pipelines and has some filtering capabilities in it. So we wrote a processor for Silk files. So you could have a per record filter and create data pipelines of analytics via NiFi, and it handles the scale appropriately. Analysis pipeline always gets a mention because I wrote it. Streaming flow analysis and alerting tool, I will keep it alive forever. So Silk stores it, retrospective analysis pipeline takes data on the way in, sends alerts as you've configured them. Mothra is a Spark-based storage for flow and application metadata. That's your domain names, your SSL certs. That's more than just what's in the flow. The AWS VPC flow log reduction that I talked about a slide or two ago, we have scripts that will do that reduction for you. And same for Azure, cleaning up some of the JSON and making the fields more usable. So these are all publicly available, free to use. They're all on the tools or on the website, available for everyone.
And Dan, before we leave this slide, and these tools have, some of them been fielded for quite some time. So they're well tested. We have a number of federal partners. As a federally funded research development center, one of the things that I enjoy most about working here is we can provide these sorts of things back to the community of interest.
Yes, that's right. They're mature, they're working, and you all get the benefits of the government investment.
Thanks, Dan.
And the insider threat question.
Sorry, a question for you, Dan. Right. So we've been talking about a series of techniques using NetFlow and other types of sensing and logging to identify threats. Well, one of the threat types I'd like to talk about is insider threat. So let's assume it's not an external entity that's trying to compromise us, but rather a trusted insider that has decided to do something malicious, or maybe something just foolish in a way that would generate anomalous activities or indicators of compromise.
These tools could absolutely be used, or any other NetFlow collection tool, for insider threat detection. For insider threats that use networks and maybe exfil data or move data around, they're going to create network connection logs. And so that they will also generate network threats and network anomalies. And so the collection and the initial analysis phases are the same. You're looking for things that shouldn't be there on the network. Late access times, large file transfers, connections to new places. What then happens to differentiate between standard SOC behavior and, say, insider threat response is who gets that alert, if you will. You determine there's something happening that an internal user is doing. It may not get sent to the SOC that deals with external adversaries. It may go to an insider threat team. But the core initial detection, the initial alert, the initial alarm kind of looks just the same.
Interesting.
Maybe focused on different things, but it's still a network connection. It's still got collected by your network sensor. There's still flow records. Then it just becomes about internal processing and incident response.
Excellent. Well, a question's coming from Brian, another question, and it's probably the right time to ask, Dan. So the question is, how do you convince an organization, or maybe the leadership of the organization, that a threat hunting capability should be introduced even when you have mature SOC? So I think at the root of this question in my mind is, what's the difference between threat hunting and responsibilities of a security operations center?
Well, for the last question, threat hunting, I've always taken it to be a more proactive approach.
I agree.
And that you're going and looking for particular threats. Some people also include that in just the automated detections. So the policy violations I mentioned earlier. If you can write an automated detection for it, it will generate alerts for you to be managed by a SOC. But threat hunting always seemed more active, more individual hand querying. But the more and more detections that you find, just the more ways you have to learn and mitigate. And the approach I would take to convince leadership to add a capability to do some of these is pointing out what questions you can't answer. Either you can't, if you're trying to convince them you need something, or that they can't. Again, can you list all the protocols on your network? Should be easy. Can we know all of the domains we're going to? Can we know all of the places that are getting SSH connections?
Mm-hmm.
Those are all knowable, very knowable things. And if an organization can't answer it, that's an argument for having these capabilities. And it's just being able to know more, especially if it's aligned to an incident response plan or a mitigation plan of when this happens, we want to take this action.
Mm-hmm.
Well, then you need to be able to have the knowledge to know something happened.
Mm-hmm.
Or starting with policy violations is also a good place to go.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. So I know we have a great deal more to present, but I do think we should probably close out the insider risk discussion. There's a question here from someone calling themselves Security Grit, and the question is tips on how to identify truly anomalous behavior. So let's say you've trusted a third party to do software development or administration, and they're doing it from a remote location, but they are, by virtue of the responsibilities, now a trusted insider. I think you've partially answered this, but any thoughts about any additional scrutiny or analysis you would do if you're worried about a group of individuals coming from an external organization providing internal support?
When there's known, I guess, remote destinations you want to monitor, it can really focus your analysis and you can get better numbers that mean more things.
Yeah.
So if you're aware of where they are and maybe what make them say what IPs they're going to connect from or what ASN range or something like that, you can have tailored filters and tailored analysis for those. You can specify how they're allowed to connect. If it always has to be an SSL connection using a modern cipher suite, not old protocols we can decrypt, you better see only traffic from those IPs. That's SSL. Start seeing SSH, totally different. You might have, you can more restrict and be informed about what they're doing because it's very tailored. You can see access times, things that can become normalized. They might have a regular behavior. And you start seeing accesses after midnight, aside from time zone differences. You can ask them, what was up with that? Because you'll know something, because it's a smaller subset of things. So you can define normal and baseline a little more easy.
Yeah, that really calls back to where the presentation started, which is having a baseline understanding is essential.
Yeah, that's the key. Knowing what normal feels like. And that leads to, as you figure out what you want to detect, I would start with what actions do you want to take? Do you want to be able to update firewall rules? Do you want to get hosts off the network? What are the mitigations you want to do? And then what information gets you there? That's the key. That's how you start. And it's purpose-driven. Different data sources give you different things. And focus on detections that give you what you need so you can take actions. That's always a good place to start, is the end action and then going backwards to the information that you need. And then it keeps building on itself. So I want to, as we come up with, I want to talk about how we do some of these detections.
Okay.
How you want to think of it, because I mentioned the translation earlier, from host of person's behavior to data and back. And so I've kind of broken it out into 5 steps, and you have to do all 5, or at least the first 4 before you get lost. And so the first one is just, what is the user behavior in English or your regular words and language that you want to define? Okay, not with numbers, just what do you want to find? Then after you've identified that, taking the step to think about what that would look like on the network. oh, well, that means a lot of DNS records, or that means improper encryption suites. That's the first thing to do, the first translation from the user behavior. And then you take the step into your data source. So what would those records look like? That means that network behavior. And if we're talking host behavior, replace the word network with host. And what's the host behavior? What's in the host records? And so description in irregular language, description on the network. What would those records look like based on your data sources? And then the last one, which is key, is what are you trying to find? Are you trying to find a flow record, or are you trying to find an IP address? Are you trying to find a domain name? You're trying to find a suite of connections. It helps you isolate and create metrics when you're trying to find an explicit thing and you know about it. And enrichment at the end always adds context. And so to do an example here.
Yeah, please.
If we want to detect hosts that are not using your DNS proxy.
Okay.
So they're either evading it or they're set up wrong. Sounds big, but that's the user behavior. Host not using DNS proxy. Well, on the network, that would mean that those records aren't being sent out to the internet by your proxy. Because that's the whole point of a proxy, to get in the way and do it for you. So anything not sending, any DNS requests not sent by the proxy would be an example of a host not using the proxy. And so now we've gotten into the record definition, outgoing DNS requests with the source address not being the proxy. And so we've taken this big, broad problem of hosts not using the proxy and gotten it down to a filter. We want to find IP addresses. We don't really care about the flows, the full flows. So now we can start grouping and aggregating data based on IP address. And now you've identified IP addresses, adding enrichment, say the department within the enterprise as a silly example. Now you've gone way down to say it was the R&D department or whatever that's doing this. And then you can find out with incident response, is it just a misconfiguration or is something weird going on?
So this critical thinking and type of inquiry applies for all situations, right? So no matter what the behavior is that you're looking to examine, it seems to me you can apply this really easy framework, right? And then it gives you a roadmap. You know in which stage of this process you're in at any time.
Yeah, it's about going step by step to get closer to the data, because you don't want to. Sometimes people have trouble jumping from I have this thought to writing queries, and then they get stuck.
So I think this is such an important slide because we've seen a number of very intimidating looking pieces of data today, but couching it with a what do I want to know and how do I get there, I think is absolutely essential.
Good, I'm glad it came across. And when you're building these detections, the whole point of the detection is to give you a starting point for an investigation or an incident response. So sometimes just good enough is okay. Sometimes you don't have to get caught in exceptions and use cases and statistical significance, and you can just start with good enough because you just need to, hey, you should look over there. That's the point of an alert, because the goal is to find things to mitigate.
It's an indicator.
It's an indicator. And so good enough at the beginning is okay. And as you triage, you'll get rid of allow listing and you make it better, but good enough is okay, because what is the real goal? To find things to mitigate. And standard deviation comes up sometimes. To be statistically significant and rigid, you have to prove that your data is a normal distribution. To say 3 levels of standard deviations away, well, there's some requirements there. However, going back to good enough is okay, sometimes just using a number of standard deviations, even if it's not normal, will give you an indicator of where to look in the tail. And it's a good start. And that's the key.
Going somewhere, even in a limited way, is better than going nowhere, is what I'm hearing. That's a really great point. So Dan, I have a question for you. We've talked about NetFlow and logging, and so far in the presentation, it seems to me it's mainly what we describe as IT or enterprise systems. Thoughts about OT, about operational technology?
They use network protocols too, not to be flippant, but there are many network sensors, ours, YAF, Zeek, Bro, et cetera, that will parse out these operational technology protocols. Even a simple identification that there is OT data going across your network and it wasn't supposed to, can be a great start. If you know, and it's allowed, that operational technology is leaving your network, because that's the plan, but maybe there's a restricted set of commands for these known protocols. And by extracting the information, you can decide, oh, commands 1, 2, and 3 are fine, but 4 is turn off the lights, so 4 should never be seen. You can monitor it and take these protocols apart and just make sure what's supposed to happen is happening. And then beyond that is the, remote destination analysis, who's doing it and all that. First, you should make sure what is supposed to be happening is the only thing that's happening. So we're gonna.
So Dan, I like your description here, helicopter parenting for your network. So you're drawing on experience that many people have of needing to provide direction and oversight and general well-being and maintenance of children. So apply this to the network context for us.
Yeah, I do assume everybody here either has kids or was a kid.
Fair assumption.
And so hearkening back to what you do as a parent or what happened to you as a kid, it's parents paying attention. Pay attention to the words your kids say. Plenty are fine. In Pittsburgh, if we hear a lot of Cleveland Browns, we might have problems. Might be an indicator that something is wrong. I bet in Cleveland, it's the reverse. And so to me, net flow is the words that your network is saying, because that is what border net flow, that's what's leaving your network. And so paying attention to that, preferably in a real-time manner, gives that extra description of what is happening on your network, but it's not all of it. Another thing we, of course, do with our kids is pay attention to them. What are they doing? Are they turning green? Did they shave their head when they weren't supposed to? Those, to me, is the EDR. That's the host data. What is happening underneath? Do they have a fever? Doesn't have to be a big dramatic thing. Do they have a fever? Take them to the doctor. They say they're fine, but they have a fever. Or they look fine, but they say things that indicate something's wrong. And so that's combination of border net flow EDR data. The cloud is very targeted. Collecting cloud logs about a very known and expected environment, to me, is akin to parent-teacher conferences. You don't ask the teacher about every aspect of their kid's life, just those 8 hours that they're at school. And therefore, they can give you very targeted, very specific information that helps complete the puzzle. And earlier you asked about zero trust, Matt. And monitoring that those connections are the only ones is the key, and to that, and key use for NetFlow. And my analogy is that's meeting your kids' friends to make sure that you like them all, but you also pay attention that those are the only friends and meet the new ones. You don't just meet the friends once and leave it alone. And a plug for proactive real-time monitoring is parenting. We don't wait for something bad to happen and then go back and read all the reports. We pay attention day to day, hour to hour, and react as quick as we can. And we try to pay attention to everything. We don't always get it all. But to me, putting this all together and trying to do it in a real-time, proactive manner really gets to how you find the next unknown, unseen threat.
Yeah, in both cases, identifying an issue and mitigating as soon as possible is the best course of action.
Yes. And sometimes you just have to set up detections and alerts that say something's going down. Log4j triggered LDAP requests. Mm-hmm. So if you were monitoring your network for what are my LDAP requests all the time, and you saw a huge spike, you wouldn't have known it was Log4j. That's a huge leap, but you'd know something was going down. Something needs to be looked into on these hosts. And putting this all together, doing it live, taking what you need for mitigations is the key.
So Dan, there's a clutch of questions here related to both scale and the proactive nature of threat hunting. So let's save the scale questions for just a bit, and let's focus on, in addition to just focusing on the right things, and how do we prepare ourselves? How do we apply your process for asking the right questions for challenges? For instance, there's a reference to phishing, right? So if you've been plagued by by phishing attempts or maybe realized risk in phishing, or you believe that there is a assumed breach and you have a strong suspicion that information is leaving your network in a way that it shouldn't, right? Thoughts about how to structure your thinking about that using the tools you've described.
The key result is you want to be able to make a decision. And so you think about what values or what identifications might cause you to make a decision. And you start there. You can go get a lot of metrics that can waste your time because you're like, well, that's true, but I'm not sure what to do with it. And so setting some initial thresholds just to see this seems like a lot. Is anything above that? And then you'll find as you keep trying, it turns out a value you thought was important wasn't. That's fine. Now you know that. And if it comes to phishing, you can also use the associated data sets like we talked about earlier to maybe give some more information around it and inform your analysis.
So it also sounds like being iterative is okay, right? You can start small and grow from there. Just focus on looking for the right things for the right reasons.
Yeah, and something that hampers a lot of people is the idea of boiling the ocean. I have to find everything at once.
Yeah.
Where you start a detection, then you hear about a new one, and you're worried you're missing it. Well, you'd be missing it anyway if you were doing nothing.
Yeah, and you can drown in the seawater, right? Boiling the ocean is always the toughest route, right?
Yes. And it's about collecting data and doing analysis that fit like I said, your workflows, your mitigations, and tailoring it to yourself. You don't want to be in a situation where you just expecting some other group or automated thing to let you know that the world's on fire. You want to have lots of knobs and switches going. I always go back to the Apollo 13 mission control. It's full of people monitoring a bunch of different things, giving a little updates. You can have a bunch of those. And there's nothing wrong with a bunch of detections that say everything's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. These are all good today. SSH connections allowed.
Yeah, so fine is a condition and a condition we're seeking, right? So that's really important to remember that. And I think there's another potential fallacy or issue that emerges, which is just because you're not finding really interesting anomalous things in your network doesn't mean your detection capabilities aren't working, right?
That's exactly right. And especially because those big, exciting, anomalous things may trigger small alarms. If every little detection that's not very exciting turns red, you know something's up and you know to dig deeper. And there's nothing wrong with being confident that this one particular aspect of your network or your hosts is doing well. That's good information.
Again, back to the question of scale. So I'm thinking about the Apollo program and the amount of data they had by today's standards, it looks very, very small. And in 5 years or 10 years, the amount of data we have will look modest by comparison. So certainly the size of the data is beyond the analysis capabilities of any one team or small team of people. You've given us a number of tools. Many of those certainly are available for free on the CERT website. But thoughts about dealing with petabyte plus volumes of information?
There's more technical and a more qualitative approach. More technical one is binary data formats, or a quarter or a third the size of JSON, all the time. So depending on how you want to store things at the back end, there's one option. But that's not a very exciting answer.
But that's an important answer, though.
It's important.
Right? Yeah, because it's real world implications cost-wise and operation for that, isn't there?
Yes. But maybe the more practical or the more broader one is understand what you want to get out of each particular data source and what you might do with it. For example, there are certain cloud logs like CloudTrail that says these are the API calls that happened. You might not need to store that forever. You just might want to have a script that looks at it on the way in and makes sure that those in your IT department are the only ones adding resources. If it's Jimmy or Susie, it's fine. I don't need to store it. See a new name, you generate an alert, but you're not storing all that data.
And it seems to me that is situational awareness. You're tailoring your capabilities to the situation.
Yeah, and if you're doing NetFlow logs, maybe the application label 0, we don't know what this is. Maybe you don't need to store the full records. You just want IP addresses in a day. Maybe
Well-
you aggregate to say, was this IP even seen? Because that's all I would ever do with it. Now you've cut your storage and, big chunk of storage out.
So Dan, I want to thank you so much for the insights you've given us today. If folks have questions after this session, certainly I know they're welcome. So please drop a line to the SCI. I'd also like to thank you for attending today. When this session has ended, please do hit the like button if you found today's information useful. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel, where you'll find other content like this. Our next webcast will be on April 2nd, and the topic is New Data Exchange Standard eases insider incident data collection. And that will be brought to us by Austin Wisnut and Dan Costa, two leading voices in insider risk. Registration information will be mailed out soon and is available on the website as well. If you have any questions, as I mentioned, from today's event or about this series, please do reach out. And thanks again, Dan.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks, everyone else.